All right, hey there, y'all, and welcome to this month's episode of This is Crucial. Charlene and I are back for another conversation on healing, justice, and equity and transformation. As always, our goal is to host conversations that are crucial enough to make us uncomfortable. Charlene, what you been up to recently?
I went to Atlanta I was a few miles. I don't know. I'm not really good on Georgia geography or Southern geography, really, but I was about, I think, 20 to 30 minutes away from our guest for today who teaches at Emory. Who teaches at Columbia. And so I was in Atlanta. What about you?
Um, been here,
Okay.
Dallas. Yeah,
Just holding it down in Texas. Well,
correct. I didn't really expect for you to ask me the question that I just asked you, so I didn't have an answer ready. But
that's okay.
yeah.
The folks in Berkeley are going to be real excited about today's guest because a few weeks back we had a conversation about competing Christianities led by one of our local clergy and dear friends, Kamal Hassan, and a member, Rick Leong. And it was about this book called What Kind of Christianity? A History of Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Presbyterian Church. Boom. It's all right there in the title. This book was written by Dr. William Yu, who, as I said, is the professor of American Religious and Cultural History and the director of the MDiv program at Columbia Seminary. Dr. Yu has written about the transnational histories of American Protestant world missions in Korea and Korean American immigrant religious communities. As Amos and I learned, he's even written about my great-grandfather, which was pretty exciting for me to hear. But his current research is on the histories of racial injustice, settler colonialism, and slavery in the U.S. And this book is hard to read. The histories that he is tracing, it's hard to hear, but it's important because it develops muscles that we need to be faithful Christians. And so I'm excited for you all to hear a conversation with William today. We talk about slavery in the Presbyterian Church. We talk about doctrine of the spirituality of the church.
Yep. And we also cover when it's okay to be ambivalent, what people mean when they say, I don't want politics in the church. And we also try to answer the question, why are we still Presbyterian? Thanks, everybody, for joining us for This is Crucial with Dr. William Yu. Enjoy the show. Dr. Yu, welcome to This is Crucial.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and feel free to call me William. And may I call you and Charlene by your first names too?
Yes, of course,
absolutely. William, what should people know about you before they start reading this book? About where you're from, who you are.
Oh, okay.
What
Thanks.
you're passionate about.
I think so. Perhaps I think people should know I am a Presbyterian historian in two ways. One, it is not unlike other academic historians. It is one of the fields in which I have devoted time in study and research, the study and research of Presbyterian and Reformed history. So in that way, I am a Presbyterian historian, in the way others might be a post-colonial historian or an African-American studies historian. But in another way, I am a Presbyterian historian because I am a minister of word and sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. And I, like both of you, took ordination vows to be a faithful minister, to proclaim the good news, to teach the faith, to care for people, and in my ministry, to try to demonstrate the love and justice of Jesus Christ. So in that way, I suppose in my call as a Presbyterian historian, I want to be clear, honest, deep, thorough, and as faithful as possible in the work that I do in any topic, but especially in the topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is Presbyterian history.
Mm.
I mean, not that you need our kind of vote of approval, but let me just say, at least on behalf of First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley, which has been wrestling with your book, What Kind of Christianity? Your faithfulness has taken you to some pretty intense places, writing about the denomination in which you are a minister of and the institution that employs you. And so, I mean, did you set out to write this book? How did the journey take you from your research into this powerful work of history, of prophetic writing, of justice, all those things?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Charlene. So I think as a historian, I am captivated by and interested in writing origin stories. And perhaps even I hope this is in a good sense, self-centered way, where in the world did I come from? So when I was a doctoral student at Emory University, one of the things you got to do is first you got to learn the canon. You got to learn what other people tell you is important in order to teach and write. But then at a certain point, you get to say, this is what I'm going to write in a dissertation that we hope eventually one day a lot of people read. By a lot, maybe I mean like triple digits. But initially, it's a committee of 3 to 5 people. And so I thought to myself, I really want to write an origin story about Korean American religious history, with particular emphasis on Protestantism, to help me understand where I came from. What did early Protestant missionaries in the Korean Peninsula do? What were the stories of early Korean American immigrants pre-1965 in the United States? And perhaps how are these stories intertwined? So I told my committee, this is what I want to do. Some were affirming, and to be honest, some were a little bit like, that's a pretty small field, William. You might want to write something in a bigger field, in a more established field, because of, chances of publication and it resonating with a broader audience, which will help you in terms of academic job market stuff. And I respectfully, I thought about it, but to be honest, Amos and Charlene, I thought, like, I might not get another shot to write an academic thing. This might be it for me. So why not write this origin story? And I'm grateful. That was I finished my PhD in 2014, but when I started the dissertation, it was about a dozen years ago. And Korean American Christian history has developed and it has grown since then. So that's a good thing. So then fast forward a few years, I thought, what's the next kind of book project I want to do? And it really was, I want to learn more about Presbyterianism. Like, where in the world did we come from? And in particular, what strivings, what successes, what struggles, and what failures have Presbyterians enacted and embodied in racial justice? So why do Presbyterians and other mainstream denominations too, why do we struggle so much with something that seems so obvious in terms of following the gospel and biblical principles,
Right.
equality of all people? God does not judge us by our skin color. So from there, I thought, I really want to write a history of race and racism in American Presbyterianism. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of going off some, but so really I thought that was going to be, I was going to write from the colonial period, the early Scots and Scotch-Irish Presbyterian immigrants, up until maybe even the present day, I thought. Try to cover the span of 300 years in a helpful book that would be accessible. So that was initially what I talked about with Westminster John Knox Press and my editor there. And they said, that's great. Why don't you go for it? And then as I started doing it, within maybe a year and a half in, I found myself dissatisfied, Charlene and Amos, with treatments of slavery. Oftentimes they were, if at most, given a chapter. And in the chapters in the history books that I was consulting, it was really treated as an abstract theological debate or like a disagreement about biblical interpretation. See, the real problem with American Presbyterians in the 18th and 19th centuries were that they didn't read the Bible correctly, or some were too literal in how they interpreted, for example, passages in the Pauline epistle, slaves obey your masters.
Right.
They didn't have the sophisticated hermeneutical tools that we have today. This was before historical critical methods of biblical interpretation, which emerged in the late 19th century. Or they got caught up in paragraph upon paragraph about how different white Presbyterian men, theologians, and pastors were interpreting certain verbs or words in the Hebrew Bible or Greek New Testament. Doulos, the word for either servant or slave in the New Testament. And I just thought, I was just really dissatisfied. This can't be the whole story. And so I started studying it more. And from there, I became like, I think this is the book I want to write, to really understand not only Presbyterianism, but to really understand slavery, to understand slavery and its intricacies. Not so much the Hebrew and Greek parsing and verbs, but what really was slavery? Like, what really were slave auctions? What really was the problems with family separation and sexual violence that were rampant in American slavery? And how did Presbyterians reflect upon those things in addition to biblical interpretation? And that's where it evolved and emerged. So I can ask you all, like, what did you all know about the history of slavery in the Presbyterian Church, even 2 years ago or 3 years ago or after seminary? Do you know what I mean by my question? I'm just curious.
Not much.
Yes, absolutely not much. I mean, if anything, I started to learn when in recent years when, names of buildings, like I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, started being questioned, like, should we change the name of this building? I'm on the board of SFTS. Should we change the name because, so-and-so professor or president of the seminary was a slave owner, but nothing to this extent. Mm-hmm. And when, so we did an adult ed event around this, around your book with the Reverend Kamal Hassan from Sojourner Truth in Richmond, and one of our members, Rick Leong, who we have to thank for you being a guest on this show. The faces in the congregation, I mean, just jaws dropping at recounting and reading some of the things, because it's never been told as a part of our story.
Yeah, me neither. I did not have I didn't go to a Presbyterian seminary at all, and even if I did, I don't think they would have offered this history. So this was it was my first journey into this history was through reading your work, Dr. Yu. And I'm very interested in how you started the book. And you started with a quote or a question that Katie Geneva Cannon, theologian and pastor, I think she's a Presbyterian pastor, asked. And the question was, what kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to blacks? And you take the title of the book from that question: what kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights to blacks? And your answer was very surprising. And I'm interested to hear you unpack it. You said that it was the Presbyterian kind of Christianity. Can you say more about that? What do you mean by that?
Oh, thanks, Amos. So one is, I do think there is consensus that perhaps the one right answer to Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon's question is the wrong kind of Christianity. And I do think in some church history classes that is presented as such. Taking seriously, for example, Frederick Douglass's 1845 autobiographical narrative, published only years after he escaped enslavement himself in Maryland, where he compares genuine Christianity with American slaveholding Christianity, and he calls it corrupt slaveholding, a woman whipping, cradle plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity. So that's the wrong kind of Christianity. But I think that is actually, while helpful, not as historically precise as we need to understand and take seriously Presbyterian participation, complicity, and active perpetuation of slavery and anti-Black racism. So why I say Amos, the Presbyterian kind of Christianity, is to look at how Presbyterians in congregations, presbytery synods, general assemblies, seminaries, and other church-related institutions, like, what did they do? How did they act? What did they profess? So, okay, a few levels. One is, so I affirm the work of other historians who note that Presbyterian clergy published more pro-slavery sermons, treatises, writings, and sermons than clergy of any other tradition in North American colonies, United States. And to note the inaction at the General Assembly, to note the ways in which, I think one comparison helps, and then I'll stop there, is to look at Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians, the three largest kind of mainstream Presbyterian denominations in the United States at the eve of the Civil War. And to note that Methodists and Baptists did split in 1844 and 1845. To note that for Methodists, it's not to say that all Methodists were abolitionists, and in fact, likely among Protestants, very few were for the immediate emancipation of enslaved persons. There were other, and we can talk about other compromises and reforms, such as the colonization movement to send both free and enslaved African Americans to Liberia. But what happened was, in Georgia, a white man, a pastor, became elected as a bishop. And enough white Northern Methodists said, no, he has inherited enslaved persons through marriage. We can't have him be responsible for leadership and oversight. So over James Osgood Andrews' election or appointment to bishop, they divided. Baptists divided in 1845 because a sufficient number of Northern white Baptists said, look, we can't be commissioning world missionaries, ministers to go out into the world to proclaim the gospel if they are enslavers. And of course, white Southern Baptists said, no, you can't do that. So they divided. And so when you look at Presbyterians, though, there was no such division, especially in the largest mainstream Presbyterian denomination until 1861. Actually 1 month after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in the U.S. Civil War. So what I found is Presbyterians were in fact deeply committed to ecclesial unity, but ecclesial unity, what that meant was they were deeply committed to preserving and perpetuating slavery, to keep the denomination united. So, and I'll end here with this. I know I probably said that already. So I found other treatments of Presbyterian history as divided. It's a church divided. Abolitionists on one side, pro-slavery Presbyterians on the other. But that's actually, I think, not true. It was actually a denomination united to drive out, whether by force for some, to drive out abolitionists who are too outspoken, or really by continued compromises and inaction to really drive out others who were just dissatisfied with the immorality, so that the denomination could remain united. And what was the doctrines? What did they profess? Yeah. So really, even after 1845, when you look at, or I've looked at the General Assembly minutes, there really was an intentional strategic effort to appoint elect moderators, temporary stated clerks, who gets to pray, who gets to preach, who gets to be chairs of committees. There was a concerted effort, though the denomination was probably 3/4 Northern membership, to have enslavers and supporters of slavery be in these prominent leadership positions. So when you look at that, you have to say the Presbyterian kind of Christianity, and I say this in a sober way and as honest as possible, was responsible for the perpetuation of slavery. there really was no division when you look at the Presbyterian Church, capital C.
What can you talk more about what happened in 1861 when the church did split? Um, can you give us a quick narrative history
Oh, I
of
can
that
try to
time?
give you some, and so it really is beginning in the 1830s, what's known as the second wave of abolitionism, where beginning really in the late 1820s, there were more stirrings and more uh, at the state level, local level, and national level, more emancipatory movements. Some note the publication of the Liberator newspaper with William Lloyd Garrison, I think January 1, 1831. Others note Freedom's Journal, the first black abolitionist newspaper, with one of the editors, Samuel Eli Cornish, a black Presbyterian pastor in New York City. Um, Others note the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was also founded in the first half of the 1830s. So a lot was going on. There was more of a consciousness nationally to support abolition and the eradication of slavery. And so with that came in the Presbyterian Church also some abolitionists within the Presbyterian Church USA that were motivated and wanting the denomination to take a firmer stand. At one level, one Presbyterian, the Chillicothe Presbyterian in Ohio, said one thing we can do is, in our polity, we can say if you are an enslaver, you cannot take the Lord's Supper or communion. So this was all going on. So really all of this came ahead even before 1861, Amos, at the 1836 General Assembly, where there were stirrings. There was, in part because in 1835, I think 198 persons signed a memorial to say, hey, the PCUSA needs to take a firmer stand, not just on slavery, but for abolition. But at that General Assembly in 1836, ultimately, what was decided was an indefinite postponement.
Yeah.
So, and it actually ended up dissatisfying both abolitionists and pro-slavery Presbyterians. Neither were actually satisfied with this compromise measure. So abolitionists obviously unsatisfied because it's like an immoral stance. We have to say something more. But pro-slavery Presbyterians in the southern states, they were also dissatisfied because, hey, are you with us or are you against us? We want to denounce the abolitionists because they are saying we are anti-Christian to the core. So you've got to make a stand. So that's really where it began. And ultimately from 1836 all the way through until 1861, it was this tension that they were trying to navigate. And ultimately, in a way, the pro-slavery Presbyterian position won.
Which is, and that to me is the fascinating part of that history in the early 19th century with Presbyterians is that in 1818, the General Assembly, I think, passed a measure or resolution or approved a theological statement saying that the enslavement of people is a gross violation of human rights. And I don't know if it was an abomination, but is inconsistent with the practices of Christianity. So that in 1818 there was a definitive sort of line drawn in the sand, not in the sand, I guess it would be the concrete or whatever. But and then yet still it seems like it continued to be litigated, that question, if the General Assembly had already um, uh, clarified the church's position on slavery being a violation of human rights. Why did it take so long, to affirm that conclusion in the church's actions? What is it about being Presbyterian? Is what I'm trying to say. That continually leads us to make make theological statements, which is something we still tend to do. Is we're really good at passing resolutions and making clarifying our theological position. Is that distinctly Presbyterian? or is that a feature of just people and institutions at large?
Oh, thanks, Amos. I don't know. I think so. In that same resolution from 1818, there are exhortations of forbearance to avoid harsh censure, criticism, or words toward enslavers. So there is, while saying slavery is inconsistent with the spirit of the gospel, a gross violation of human rights, there is also that impulse that has existed throughout American Presbyterian history to keep the unity of the spirit in the bond of peace.
Yeah.
And it is the press, you said it is both the promise and peril of trying to do church together. So even now, when we look at the Presbyterian Church USA, some will say it's a leaning progressive denomination. Some will say it's a moderate denomination. I think depending on how you view it and where you live and what kind of church you are worshiping in. But in reality, it is actually, I think, we are, all three of us, in a denomination with less moderates, like people who are genuinely moderate or genuinely like, I'm not really sure on this issue or that issue. I'm really open to this position or that position. But really, in some ways, it's a denomination of maybe 1/3 to 40% of people who are pretty convinced that more conservative approaches theologically and politically are the way to promote flourishing and justice, and another 1/3 to 40% of people of faith who are convinced that the progressive ways of thinking, including policies, are the way to promote justice and flourishing, and maybe at most, right, a fourth to 20% who are genuinely like, on one thing, I'm going to go one way, and another thing, I'm going to go another way. So then, Amos, what you have is you have all of us trying to live together. And so so I don't mean to make that analogy between the 1830s, 40s, and 50s and today. That's more a contemporary observation. So that is one thing about Presbyterianism today, that we have diverse people, diverse viewpoints that are all trying to grapple and live and struggle together in faith. And if we're really honest, one part of why we are trying to live together and struggle in faith is not only because of our theology, but because of our polity. It is because it's in governance. Is it G40203? Church property is held in trust. That a congregational building does not belong to the congregation, but it belongs to the presbytery, synod, or general assembly. So it is very difficult for congregations to leave the PCUSA. So we're figuring out how to do all of this. I think, so that's something about Presbyterianism. So I do think, and maybe we can talk some, and I'll ask you all. One thing I want to share is that I think in the antebellum period, it was the economic centrality of slavery and its foundational roots that really did influence. And again, this is an explanation, not an excuse, but influence white Presbyterians to be what some noted back then. They are anti-slavery, but also anti-abolition. Right? That they really understand slavery is wrong and they wish it would go away. But they are also against abolition because they are worried about the social changes that would come from an economy that was both in the southern and northern states so dependent upon enslaved labor. Yeah. So you had that. So there was a real suspicion and a real antipathy toward the kind of social changes that would disrupt foundational realities. And what do you all think? Do you see that today in your congregations or in just the Presbyterian ministries that you participate and lead? That kind of concern about social change and the what if and how will this disrupt our lives, our neighborhoods, our congregations, etc.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. We did a conference on climate change and climate justice. And what I appreciated is one of the presenters went, so much of it was research, meta, all these things. And this is the rate in which our world is dying and just in destruction. And then you had someone who was like, okay, these are the things you can do to slow down the rate of the deterioration of God's creation. And one of them was like, take one less transatlantic flight a year. And I'm looking at my mom who loves to travel, and she was just like, ugh. Like, it was just like, stop ordering stuff on Amazon. Like, all of these things, which feel less high stakes than participating in the slave trade. Right. And so we're kind of giving ourselves a pass, but absolutely holding these values at a big scale and talking about it and preaching about it. I'm guilty of all of these things. I almost ordered your book from Amazon. Instead, I got it from, I think, like Cokesbury or something like that. But yeah, it's rampant. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people like to be around other people who are like them, so, and yet still we end up with, I mean, churches like the one I serve, where I would describe us as um, uh, politically and theologically, probably more politically than theologically diverse congregation. Um, and I try not to use the common term for that, which is, that we're a purple church. I don't know. And the reason I don't say we're a purple church is because it's oftentimes you say that, and what people mean by that when they say we're a purple church is like, don't do anything to disturb the purple. Like, this is we like this color. It's a way to avoid conversations. Just say this is a purple church. So I don't know.
It's a badge of
Yeah.
honor,
Yeah,
because I think we love our diversity.
we do.
Right? I mean, it's a cultural value, diversity outside the church, inside the church. And so, but what I hear in Amos's question and your answers too is like, what comes at the cost of trying to maintain that diversity in the name of unity? And it means saying a lot of things, but not necessarily doing the hard thing. Right? And you said it's our polity, it's also our theology. Right? Is it the fact that of like total depravity, we don't trust anything, so we're so reticent to make any kind of a human origin decision because we're like, well,
Oh, yeah, so I do. So while I was writing the book, and I was just talking to people about it, actually, one of the things that were suggested to me is it's probably because Presbyterians were Reformed people of faith.
okay.
And it was probably the theology. But then when I really thought about it and I looked at both pro-slavery writing and abolitionist criticism of pro-slavery kind of theology, in fact, the abolitionist accusation really was that the Reformed tradition does inform a kind of anti-institutionalism, a suspicion of monarchy, a suspicion of tyranny, a suspicion of anything that will disturb freedom of liberty or liberty of conscience. And that, look, Reformed people in Geneva and then particularly in Scotland, which for some early American Presbyterians was the mother or parent church. It was a church. It was a Reformed tradition that was deeply motivated to resist tyranny, and also one that was to promote change, social change. And again, part of the argument when you have Geneva with John Calvin and then John Knox in Scotland and that history was they were established church and state. It was kind of united in one. It was in some ways a theocracy. So so then you kind of come to the United States, and really it was like some American Presbyterian abolition were saying we need to really tap into that Reformed tradition, and we need to do likewise. We need to stand for the oppressed, and we need to really seek institutional, systematic change. And others would say, actually, no, we're not a theocracy. We're actually a democracy. It doesn't work that way. And so there we can talk about it some. It really became this kind of apolitical position that became known in Presbyterianism in the United States as the doctrine of the spirituality of the church. Mm-hmm. That kind of linking to another part of Reformed history, like churches should be separate from politics because politics corrupts. Mm-hmm. And really what churches do best are preaching, proclamation, teaching of the word, and offering sacraments. For us, in our tradition, it is baptism and the Lord's Supper. So we should not get involved in political movements. But if we can do word and sacrament well, all of the people in our churches, they will be instructed and nurtured well so that they can make the political decisions that they need to outside of the church. Right. So we can stay pure. So I do think, but to note, and I think we can have healthy dialogue, if not even disagreement and debate on that doctrine. But for me as a historian, Charlene and Amos, I want to know where that came from. Yeah. The root of that doctrine was to defend slavery. Jeez. Like certainly we can say, maybe some who disagree with me, you can tell I'm not for this doctrine. But even if another Presbyterian disagreed with me, perhaps their argument might be, yes, it came from slavery, but here's how it's evolved. But I find that's actually not how the debate goes. It is a kind of ahistorical debate that totally ignores the roots of where it came from. Yeah. And in fact, I'm not the only one. There were several in the 1850s and in the 1950s and 60s during the civil rights movement who were saying this doctrine of the spirituality of the church is actually a betrayal of the Reformed tradition. Mm-hmm. It is antagonistic to early modern Europe and how it all developed. So I would love for us to talk about it. I wanted to ask you too, with the idea of kind of politically diverse churches. One thing I find challenging in our American context is, for example, I've heard some say, so our church and me as a minister, I'm going to be political but not partisan. Maybe you've heard that too.
Yes.
Or
yeah.
I'm going to try to figure out how to engage like civil dialogue. And I think that's all true and good. One challenge to me is that we live in a two-party political system that is inherently partisan to some degree. I don't want to say like super hyper-partisan and hatred of one another, but it really is on every matter. If it's a multiple choice test, there's really only A and B. Yeah. I know sometimes we can say C, D, E, but ultimately C, D, E don't. Yeah. So then how do you work in congregations that can help people be like fully engaged and informed, and even to say, look, you're going to have to pick A or B. So we're going to try to study the issues. And on some topics, perhaps the Republican candidate is better. And when looking at justice, and you can't get everything. In other ways, the Democratic candidate would be better. And so we're going to do that. But I actually think that sometimes I wonder if that's like a pipe dream. I don't know where that really happens in churches. I don't know. I don't know if you all have children. So I've got a 14 and 12-year-old now, turning 15, my oldest. In a few years, it's like my eldest kid is going to get the right to vote. And it's like a super big deal. And my eldest kid is super excited about it, and we're excited about it. But then it's odd to me, like, to go to church and no, we're never going to talk about that. Right. We're never going to talk about one of the most sacred, holy, beautiful things that you get to do as an American adult. And so I wonder how we can have like healthy conversations, because politics is just a foundational reality of our lives. It's like the fish swimming in water, and someone says, how's the water? And the fish are like, what's water? Yeah. It's just because nothing happens apart from politics.
It's also, I mean, when Presbyterians say, let's keep politics out of the church, I'm like, we are political. Like our system of governance, our model for church governance is inherently political. I mean, we elect, you know, elders. We elect people to nominating committees. Um, uh, we have term limits, for our elders and for our members of our committees, and there are often just two choices when we've got to take action. It's either yes or no. We build coalitions to to encourage the church to act in particular ways. We choose, represented. We are the body's represented. The whole community is represented by people that are particularly called, to be ruling elders and teaching elders in the church. But so I'm like, we do politics here all the time, just nonstop. I mean, I don't know if we, so, and yet still, I mean, I, I don't, I, I hear that a lot more now than,
Hear what?
and like, let's let's keep politics out of the pulpit, or the church is getting too political, or maybe you know um, I'm tuned into it now more than I have been in the past, but I definitely hear it more so now, than I used to. And um, yeah, and I think that means different things to different people when they say that. I don't let's not have politics in church, or I didn't come to church to be political. And so that's something I've been reflecting on as of late, is like, what are the different, like, how are people defining that differently? You know? Um, so
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question about can we have these conversations within our church, or is that a pipe dream? I mean, I was really convicted by all that doctrine of, what was it, spirituality?
Yeah, of the church. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've said that exact line about part not partisan but political, like, and have found it really hard to navigate. I mean, I'm not in Georgia or Texas. California is like a pretty deeply entrenched blue state, but its politics are very complicated, and so to talk about a candidate means talking about all the, like, I can promote a candidate, but then there's like a weird side issue. Like, politics has just become so complicated. So to talk about individuals over issues, I feel like is a disaster waiting to happen, because it's all hidden. Like, this person supports maybe 8 things that as a Christian I support, and then 2 things that are kind of like sketchy and da 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 da. And so I would say how we as a church are, in our own very imperfect way, trying to address things that impact us, aka politics, is talking about issues that would then drive how we vote. I mean, it's exactly what you said, which then kind of makes me feel sheepish. It's like, we're going to do all of that work so that by the time we release you into the world, you have everything you need to do to vote your conscience as a Christian. But all that to say, William, I'm not doing it well. I don't know. I feel very ill-equipped.
yeah,
I mean, in that regard, as a professor at a seminary, I'm really interested in what today's seminarians are coming in asking for, looking for, expecting from a seminary education training to go into churches. Like, this book was not available when I was in seminary. And so your students have access to this, and you, in a way that I'm like, that's amazing. So are you seeing that there's a hunger amongst your students to get more political, to get, like, are they saying it's not an option, we want to talk about this? Or are they still kind of just like, unity of the church?
Oh, yeah, Charlene. That's a good question. Of course, there are lots of different answers because there are lots of different students.
Right.
I think, me too. I think part of what took me longer to write the book than I wanted, and probably more my editor wanted, if I'm being totally honest, is it was in some ways writing a history that I never learned.
Mm.
So I do. So a few things. One is I do think. I do think the teaching and learning of Christian history and Presbyterian history needs to get a lot better. In this part, I think, and this is how I was grew up, nurtured, and raised too, like Christian history, and I think this is happening, quite frankly, with U.S. history too. And we can talk some about the ways these are colliding and conflating. It really is a story or a past where we're looking for role models. We're looking for witnesses, uh, women, men, people of faith who really inspire us and who really challenge and convict us to do good, act justly, and all of that. And I think that's good. We need certainly role models, and history needs to provide that for us. But if that's all that's providing for us, it actually isn't giving us a real, honest, full view of the past and where we came from. So that when we learn hard things, we learn about in the church, but also in the United States, the moral contradictions between the democratic principles and the enslaving practices of the founding political leaders of this country. It really, and then the church too, it really throws some people off. Like, that can't be it. Like, that can't be what it means, or how the United States came to be, or how the Presbyterian Church in the United States came to be. And so we do need to figure out ways to better prepare students from the ground up. So that I liken it to, I don't do a lot of weightlifting. I tried to do a little bit with the dumbbells, the 10-pound. Well, I'm going to be honest, the 7-pound things I started with, and 5, 7, 10, and I got up to 15, 20. But then one day, a friend of mine was like, we're at the YMCA before the pandemic, and let's do the bench press, and let's try to do it. And I was totally inequipped. I think it was just 100 pounds. Yeah, maybe a little bit more with the bar. And I didn't know how to do it. I could not bench press it. It was so painful. I didn't have the muscles to do it. Mm-hmm. And why I share that, Charlene and Amos, is I do think people of faith, and even some Americans, don't have the muscles to really grapple with the hard truths about nationalism, about faith, about democracy, and some of the broken promises and contradictory realities of faith and democracy. So we need to do that. I think another challenge my students and I talk about, and I think Amos, you and Charlene are good kind of mentors for my students in this regard. How can a congregation or worship church, how can it be a space that both provides comfort and challenge?
Yeah.
Sometimes people are coming to church, and some of my students and I talk about this, because they've had a really hard week. And there's a lot of pain going on. So it doesn't feel like that's the moment on Sunday morning to kind of convict everyone, hey, we're not doing enough to follow the call of the gospel. Do you know what Bonhoeffer said about discipleship? It doesn't feel like that's the moment. Mm-hmm. How do you know when to comfort? And you've heard this too. I think it's a kind of poet thing. How do you know when to afflict? Right? How do you know when to comfort the afflicted? How do you know when to afflict the comfortable?
Right.
And so much of I feel like our church DNA and the Presbyterian Church and other Protestant denominations, it actually, there's not a lot of, using my bench press analogy, there's actually not a lot of, in the bones to do the affliction and the challenging. Mm-hmm. If we're honest, I think sometimes people want to come to church to be comforted, and that's okay. But then it's not okay when it just becomes to be comfortable, right? So how do you do that? How do you figure out how to lead in a way that's effective and doesn't feel like I'm pushing too hard or I'm not pushing enough?
Yeah, you can't do it if you don't know the people that you've been called to lead, to serve with and beside. So there's no book really, that you can pick up. There's no seminar or conference you can go to. To be able to know, when to move faster and when to slow down, and when, to be able to read read the room in the sanctuary and to be able to sense, what's happening in the community in a particular week or in a particular month. You have to know your community. You have to know the people. You have to love them. You actually have to love them deeply. And if you don't take time to not just learn how to love them, but also learn how to receive their love, then proclamation is just um, it's just an exercise, in a mechanical exercise as opposed to a communal experience. So, and I think that's the hard. Like for me, I don't know seminary students that well these days. I don't know what's happening on seminary campuses, but I, I'm a principal fear of mine as it relates to the church is we're becoming experts at nurturing and building up leaders who have a very strong prophetic voice, especially in the public square, um, and um, and really maybe even have gifts for being like a public theologian, and yet congregational, like are we equipping our seminarians for like the nitty gritty, like slow, mundane parts of pastoral leadership where, like the door's closed and you're holding somebody's hand while they're weeping and they're grieving the
Right.
death of their, 98-year-old mother or father. And, can you
Yep.
stay there in that moment, which is, I think, where you build you establish the, um, like the authority to be able to get up in a pulpit and afflict people.
Yep.
If they don't know you love them, I mean,
Right.
it doesn't matter. You have all the most, really beautiful words and have a really like a booming voice and, do a lot of movements and stuff, and it won't matter.
I mean, this is where I would say is interesting in terms of maybe the history as we talk about origin stories. And I think some of the histories that the three of us have inherited as Presbyterian ministers is like definitely this the primacy of the word, right, of scripture. And then from that came the primacy of the preached or proclaimed word, right? Like it's our worship services are built around it. I would definitely stand next with my music director and agree with our music director and say that music stands alongside the proclamation of the word, the liturgy, the music. But in this kind of intellectual culture, the proclamation becomes the method, the vehicle of exactly what you're talking about, either comforting or afflicting. And the deeper I've gone into ministry, the more I take issue with how much the pulpit is on a pedestal. Mm-hmm. So everything that Amos is saying, it's like we keep on coming back to how do we use those 15, depending on how long you preach, 12 to 25 minutes to do all that work. You can't, you shouldn't. In fact, I read a really good blog about Lent. In Lent, preach less, talk less. Like, this is where we should be contemplating and praying and shutting up. And yet our tradition as Presbyterians is read more, talk more, blah more, right? And so that's the real discipline for me. Because on any given Sunday, if I preach either a very hopeful sermon or a very challenging one, it's going to be split in the pews what people need. So some of those people will need to be comforted. Some of those people want to be afflicted. And, and then it's personality. It's not even seasonal. It's like some people just always want the to-do. And some people always want the affirmation. And so in that small portion of my job that requires me to get up into the pulpit, it's what does the text say, right? Because if it's pushing you in a direction to afflict, like how can you not go in that direction? I mean, obviously there's moments like California had in pretty rapid succession, those 2 mass shootings. And that's when I would say we rest in the music and the liturgy, and it doesn't always have to be the sermon that does all the quote unquote spiritual formation or work. But I don't think our tradition has been very good about making us well-rounded Christians. And this is a part of modernity as well. We're Amazon people. We love our things fast. We want our church in an hour. And I mean, I want my church in an hour. I don't like a service longer than an hour. But how are we doing that comforting and afflicting Monday through Saturday as well as a church? How are we building those practices or those muscles? Exactly that, William, those muscles, because gosh, we're so weak on that, on that front.
And also I'm sorry, go ahead, Shirley.
No.
And I just wanted to add on to what you were saying and say, also, in what ways are we, as preachers and as pastors, positioning ourselves throughout the week so that we might be afflicted by the proclamation of the community as well. Have we made ourselves vulnerable in such a way, and positioned ourselves in such a place that we might also be afflicted because of feedback or critique or an invitation or to go somewhere or do something or participate or share in something. So
all right, well, I have a final question for us, and it was the question that was on everyone's mind at the end of the conversation about your book. I don't know if you know the Reverend Kamal Hassan, William, Dr. You should. He did justice to your book and said the hard thing, so much so that at the end of the conversation, the lingering question was, why are we Presbyterian? Like, if what kind of Christianity is, if the answer to that question is a Presbyterian one, at what point do we say, yikes, and leave the denomination or leave the history, or I don't know. And so that's my question to you. So having written this book about the institution in which you work in, the denomination which you serve in, why do you continue forth as a Presbyterian minister of the Word and Sacrament, as a professor at Columbia Seminary?
Oh yeah, thanks, Charlene. And I know of Reverend Kamal Hassan, and we've been rectangle boxes on Zoom together before
great.
in the past, but unfortunately we've never met in 3D or 4.
Okay.
I don't know what it is in person, but I think that is a good question. And I don't know if Reverend Kamal Hassan said this, but I think it is a question that many Presbyterians of color have asked themselves many times. I am reminded of Gayrod Wilmore, who wrote Black and Presbyterian and was involved, one of the leaders in the civil rights movement and one of the leaders in then it was called the UPC USA, the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, 60s and 70s. And it was hard. He made a lot of progress, got a lot of backlash. And he says Black Presbyterians are ambivalent about Presbyterianism, but not ambiguous. And the point I think he's trying to make there is ambiguous implies a kind of uncertainty. I don't really know why I'm doing this, but I'm going to keep doing it. But ambivalent actually is, I'm clear about what I love, and I'm clear about what I want to discard and what I oppose and what is not useful and what is not helpful to me. So I can be ambivalent about, for some people, quite frankly, I'm ambivalent about my family, extended family. I know what I love about them, and I know where there's some danger. I'm ambivalent about this and that. And I think that kind of ambivalence is healthy. I think it's to say, this is what I love and appreciate about being Presbyterian. So for me, I will say, I am a minister member of an imperfect denomination. But it is the denomination where I believe I can best serve God and enact justice, love, grace, and righteousness. That doesn't mean I'm always in love with the PCUSA, but this is where I believe God is called, and this is where I believe I can do God's work the best. So I am ambivalent. And I think that kind of, I think what's hard, Amos and Charlene, is quite frankly, some Presbyterians have never had to have that, wrestle with that kind of ambivalence before. So again, to use my bench press analogy, it feels like you're saying, lift this 100 pounds when you've never done anything on the dumbbells, let alone on the bench.
Right.
So that is in part. So and the one other thing I'll say about that is I do think also Presbyterians would be helped, I guess, and I feel bad, I'm getting on a soapbox a little bit, by learning how to receive both the heroism and criticism of, for example, Black Presbyterians and other Black and white abolitionists. Like, there were heroes of faith. Theodore S. Wright, the first Black graduate of Princeton Seminary, class of 1828, he is a hero of faith. Some of the early women who really broke stained glass ceilings, Margaret Towner, Rachel Henderlight, Katie Geneva Cannon. But it is, in addition to their heroism, how do we also take seriously and learn from their criticism? Right? They were deeply heroic pioneers, and a pioneering journey is inherently hard. But they also had deep criticisms of the church that they belonged to and served. So we too have to be able to engage the criticism, past, present, and future. So I think that's one way, I think, why I stay Presbyterian and how we can stay Presbyterian. I think what's a totally unhelpful pathway is to pretend that there is no criticism, to take any kind of ambivalence and say, no, 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 that's not for me. That's not how I am going to be a person of faith. And I think that happens too. And that to me is a pretty unfruitful way to do it. Sadly, I think you can get pretty far that way in some pockets of the Presbyterian Church, capital C. But I don't know how effective it is. I don't know how genuine it is. So I'll leave with that. I hope that's helpful. I don't know how you all think about all of that.
That's actually pretty right on to what Kamal said. I mean, he did not leave for the possibility that he would never leave the Presbyterian Church. But he said, right now, this is where I feel I can serve the best, and where God is calling me to be. And there's enough here that's keeping me that outweighs the things that I am ambivalent about. Or so no, I still appreciate that. I appreciate the courage I imagine it took. I don't want to define your experience for you, but to write this book. And so I deeply feel challenged and pastored by this conversation. So thank you so much for the hours of research, and then taking that research and turning it into what I feel is like a very thoughtful critique. And my hope and prayer is that we, through stuff like this, through conversations like this, we can together build that muscle as a community where we can have these hard conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, William.
All right. Thank you all.
It's been great to have you on here.
Thanks, Amos. Thanks, Charlene. It's been a delight for me too.